Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. We're coming to you from Global Alts in Miami by iConnections, and joining me for this segment, we have John Devine, Head of Strategy at BlockFills, who's also the author of Bitcoin Options. We're here to discuss the evolution of institutional Bitcoin products, adoption, and allocation. John, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks, and you have an interesting perspective. Tell us about where BlockFills sits within the digital asset ecosystem and some of what you're noticing in terms of the institutional approach to Bitcoin.
Sure, well, thank you for having me, Jill. BlockFills, we have an interesting perspective on the institutional side of things. We are a market maker and a liquidity provider serving hedge funds, asset managers, Bitcoin mining companies, proprietary trading groups, and brokers. And we're starting to see a lot more interest coming into the space from, I would say, a more traditional focused asset manager, especially here at this conference. The conversations have been very focused on how do we step into this market? How can we start participating? And those conversations have been quite productive.
Yeah, you could just tell by the presence of who is here, whether it's the allocators, the issuers, and so forth. I think to your point, where TradFi and DeFi, those lines are less defined and they're more blurred at this point, so you're starting to see familiarity between the asset classes and the user experience improving, which to me is a sign of maturity in the space. But your book, Bitcoin Options, in my mind, okay, now we can see the institutional adoption momentum here, because now you're thinking like a portfolio manager or an asset allocator when you have derivative products off of the underlying.
Certainly, and the first thing I start to say is, well, if you're not exposed to this asset class, you're short this asset class, right? And so now asset managers are starting to say to themselves, how can we get involved? And with options markets, there's some very interesting things that can be done. And so what we're focused on here is talking some strategy with, how can you put a position on in Bitcoin intelligently, not just buying the asset, but maybe utilizing the options market to establish something. I'll give you an example, a cash secured put, for example. You sell that put option, you have an obligation to own the asset, you get paid a yield. And Bitcoin is a 70 vol asset. So asset managers are going to be able to find a way to monetize that volatility. Once you're in a position, Bitcoin, Ether, Solana, go down the list, now you can start to think about selling optionality, selling call options out of the money, start to generate some income against the asset. Even for protection, selling call options to pay for put options. That's a very common strategy being done in traditional finance and in crypto, and we're starting to see a lot more interest in that perspective.
How do you see from the market making perspective, how do you see the liquidity profiles improving? Because to your point before, it is an attractive space to make money, but the more it scales, the more providers get involved, that profile might change a bit.
Sure. So the liquidity in options, for example, has grown tremendously over the past, I'll call it 7 years. Let's say Bitcoin options became a market over the counter primarily 2017, 2018. We started to see some offshore exchanges get involved in that, and that started to really accelerate the infrastructure build out to price these options and to provide liquidity. It really wasn't until, I would say, later end of 2020, 2021, where liquidity really beefed up, and it became a market where capital could really get deployed. And since then, these markets are on fire, I'll say, and there's a lot of trading going on, and liquidity is there to handle it.
What do you think the next catalyst will be? We know, seeing some of the ETF products and so forth. The general consensus has been, obviously there'll be more products derived and so forth, but now that we're more constructively talking about framework, that's kind of the next catalyst here.
This is what I'm focused on right now. The ETF build out has been tremendous for exposure to the asset class and helping traditional players get exposure. But where I think the most interesting part of this market is the in-kind market, not the ETF. The ETF is fine, but being able to have actual Bitcoin as collateralization mechanism for options or other derivatives, that's the sweet spot. Being able to hold this coin, self-custody the coin. There's also some very interesting things happening on the infrastructure side, such as like tri-party collateralization wallets, where asset managers can keep their Bitcoin or Ether or Solana in a qualified custodian wallet, and liquidity providers can recognize that as collateral. And this is something that's really going to accelerate in 2025, and I think beyond.
That's an interesting point that you make. Any key themes in the book, Bitcoin Options, that stand out, or something we should be aware of? Sneak peek into the book, if you will.
Yeah, sure. The subheading of the book is energy storage, risk management, and real yield. So the idea is, how do Bitcoin volatility is likely to compress in the coming years, but while we are still a 70 plus vol asset, let's monetize it, right? So that's the theme, is generating yield from short optionality, establishing positions with short puts, as we talked about. I even think that some of the exotic options are going to start coming into play, and what I mean by that is knock-in put options, for example, some cheap downside protection against a long core spot position, and even financing these exotics with vanillas is quite. It's coming into play. Selling a vanilla call option to pay for a knock-in put option, for example. There's a lot of things going on that are going to start really making some noise, I think, this year.
Yeah, I think reading between the lines, though, understanding the underlying asset is what's key to it.
Certainly. And look, I'll say this, at iConnections here, we've been having those serious conversations. I mean, there are managers here that really want to get involved, but they want to get some inside perspective on what is this asset class? What is some of the fundamentals, which I love covering, and of course I cover that in the book as I introduce Bitcoin to the world.
All right, John, appreciate the insight.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from Global Alts. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Report.